Ethan Thorne, a man who built temples of glass and steel across the Chicago skyline, felt the foundation of his own life crumble into dust. At 42, standing on the precipice of his divorce, he realized the success he had cultivated. The penthouse in the West Loop, the acclaimed firm, the magazine covers was nothing more than an elaborate scaffold around a hollow core. He sat in his bespoke leather chair, the glow of the city, a smear of orange and white against the panoramic glass. On his mahogany desk, beneath the polished lamp that cost more than his first car, lay the physical manifestation of his surrender. The petition for dissolution of marriage. 4 crisp, intimidating pages. The sight of Clara's name, typed neatly next to his, felt like a betrayal of a promise he couldn't quite remember making. For 6 months, their marriage had been an exercise in performative coexistence. They moved around each other in their 4,000-square-foot apartment, like silent, high-stakes dancers, careful not to collide. The distance wasn't measured in miles, but in the length of their silences at the dinner table. The lack of a shared glance when the New York Times featured one of their projects, and the deliberate space between them in their king-sized bed. Ethan had rationalized it all as the natural erosion of passion, the cost of 2 ambitious careers. Now, he called it what it was: death. Clara, his wife, was the other half of this broken equation. A formidable figure in the interior design world, her recent withdrawal had been profound. She was constantly on the phone in hushed tones, her schedule mysteriously packed, her eyes carrying a tired, preoccupied look that Ethan chose to interpret as guilt. He had convinced himself she was seeing someone, a cleaner, simpler explanation than admitting he, Ethan Thorne, was simply unlovable after 15 years. He picked up a pen, the familiar cold weight of the metal anchoring him to the present. He needed to sign this. He needed to make the void official, to free himself from the exhausting effort of maintaining a beautiful lie. Was this his failure, or hers? The question, an echo from his therapist's office, hung heavy in the stale office air. He remembered the early days in their cramped Brooklyn apartment, fueled by takeout pizza, and the audacity of their architectural dreams. They had promised each other that success wouldn't change them, but it had carved them into harder, sharper versions of themselves, better suited for boardrooms than bedrooms. A memory flashed. Clara, 7 years ago, crying over a mood board, frustrated that a client had dismissed her vision. He had held her, tracing the delicate curve of her spine, assuring her of her genius. That Clara, the vulnerable, fiercely creative woman, had vanished, replaced by the cool, impeccably armored professional who now inhabited the adjacent bedroom. That woman, he reasoned, deserved the freedom he was about to grant her. He smoothed the paper. The pen hovered over the line marked petitioner's signature. He was about to press down, to commit to the irreversible break, when a sound from the master suite's dressing room, adjacent to his office, sliced through the perfect silence of the apartment. It was Clara's voice, low, strained, and unmistakably urgent. He froze, the pen a millimeter from the page. He could only make out fragments, a low, desperate murmur, punctuated by sharp intakes of breath. He could hear the distinct quality of a speakerphone, the voice slightly metallic, yet carrying the unmistakable timbre of deep distress. He didn't need to hear the words clearly. The tone alone was the confirmation he had subconsciously sought. The covertness, the tremor, the absolute secrecy. This was it. The conversation he knew was happening, the evidence of his betrayal. The pen dropped from his numb fingers, clattering softly against the desk. He sat back, his heart hammering against his ribs, not with pain, but with a terrible, vindictive certainty. He had caught her. He had been about to file for divorce based on speculation. But now, he would file with proof, and he had to hear every single word. The silence of their shared failure was over. The listening had just begun. He slowly pushed his chair back and crept toward the thin, soundproofed door separating his solitude from her confession. Ethan moved with the predatory silence of a man whose world was about to be rearranged by a simple conversation. His office, usually a sanctuary of controlled chaos, now felt like a cramped stakeout room. He pressed his ear against the heavy, soundproofed pocket door of the master dressing room, the mahogany cool against his skin. The sound was muffled, distorted by the dense wood, but Clara's distress was a raw, undeniable current. The first coherent words he caught made the blood rush to his ears. A hot, dizzying wave of confirmation. No, Mark, I can't. Not yet. He simply can't know the truth. Quote, Mark. The name, sharp and clean, pierced through the silence. Ethan had never known a Mark in Clara's professional or social circle. The name felt like a brand, searing the proof onto his certainty. His initial suspicion of infidelity hardened instantly into fact. The successful, elegant facade of his wife was peeling away, revealing the sordid, predictable clichés beneath. Clara's voice lowered again, thick with emotion, sounding dangerously close to a sob. It's been so lonely. Handling all of this on my own. I see him, Ethan, and he looks so fragile lately. He just lost the Blackwood bid. He's already retreating. The irony was a bitter taste in Ethan's mouth. Fragile? Retreating? He wasn't retreating. He was preparing for war. And she, the adulteress, was concerned with his emotional state? It was a masterful, manipulative performance. He could almost admire the audacity. He strained to catch more, needing details, location, a timeline, the ammunition for the lawsuit. And the deadlines are impossible, Mark. The constant travel is exhausting. I had to cancel the Milan trip, remember? And I can't keep using the firm's urgent client crisis as an excuse. He's beginning to ask too many questions about where I really am. It's becoming too difficult. Too difficult. That phrase resonated with a deep, personal sting. Yes, Clara, running a secret life is difficult, but the mention of travel and canceled trips offered a confusing wrinkle. Clara's recent business trips, the very ones Ethan had silently resented for their mysterious urgency, were now being discussed with this Mark. Was the affair taking place on these trips, or were the trips themselves the cover? Ethan's mind raced, building a narrative of betrayal. He pictured an intimate hotel room in Milan, hushed conversations over room service, and the meticulous planning of their deceit. His architect's brain, trained to assemble complex systems from disparate parts, was now ruthlessly constructing the blueprint of his wife's infidelity. He remembered a fleeting moment 2 weeks ago, when Clara had flinched slightly when he tried to help her with her heavy carry-on bag. He had dismissed it then, but now, he replayed the scene. Was she protecting a secret note, or perhaps a gift from her lover? The small details of their shared life, once innocuous, were being reinterpreted through the cruel lens of suspicion. He clenched his fists, the rage simmering just below the surface, threatening to shatter his carefully maintained composure. He felt a deep sense of moral superiority. He was the wronged party, the victim of a calculated deception. This conversation, this fragile thread of sound, was the proof he needed to walk away clean, untainted by doubt. Suddenly, the tone shifted. Clara's voice dropped lower, becoming a raw whisper of pain. I know the risk, Mark, but I had to. I just want one more meeting before I tell him. I need to be absolutely sure of the prognosis. I need to know what I'm facing before I break him too. He's not strong enough for this right now. Please. Just one more week. Seize 9. Seize 9. The word meeting didn't sound like a tryst. Prognosis, and break him too, felt out of place in a lover's discourse. Ethan's narrative faltered, momentarily stalled by the introduction of medical terminology. Prognosis? What kind of meeting? What kind of truth? involved a prognosis. He pressed harder against the door, desperate to discard this confusing tangent and return to the comforting certainty of infidelity. He was ready for the pain of being cheated on, but the suggestion of something deeper, something potentially tragic, was infinitely more terrifying. His anger began to dilute, replaced by a cold, unfamiliar dread that tightened his chest. He stood there, the celebrated architect, reduced to a desperate eavesdropper, listening not just for betrayal, but for the shape of the unknown catastrophe that was enveloping his wife. The muffled intensity behind the door continued, but the language remained stubbornly ambiguous. Ethan's focus sharpened on the fragments that managed to bypass the soundproofing. The pain comes and goes, especially in the mornings, Mark. I can manage the work, but I don't know if I can face the last appointment alone. Not yet. The last appointment. Ethan mentally wrestled with the phrase. In the context of an affair, it could mean the final, heartbreaking farewell rendezvous, or perhaps a secret meeting with a divorce lawyer to finalize the logistics of separation. But the mention of pain felt jarringly out of place, a discordant note in the symphony of deceit he was trying to conduct in his mind. He closed his eyes, fighting the insidious doubt that threatened to dismantle his righteous anger. He needed to hold on to the clean, sharp pain of betrayal. It was easier than the terrifying uncertainty of a hidden illness, or a burden too large for Clara to carry alone. He rejected the possibility that her struggles were internal, choosing the simpler external villain. His internal monologue was disrupted by a vivid memory, unwelcome but potent, of the last time they had truly connected. It was 3 months ago. After a difficult and celebratory firm dinner, they had returned home late, buoyed by champagne and the shared glow of their professional success. In the hallway, she had stopped him, not with a word, but with a look of exhausted desire that had been absent for years. He remembered the texture of her silk dress slipping beneath his fingers, the frantic, urgent way they had bypassed the stairs and collapsed onto the velvet chaise in the living room. It wasn't tender or lingering. It was a desperate, mutual confirmation that they were still capable of feeling something outside the spreadsheet and the floor plan. It was raw, almost violent in its passion. A brief, ferocious act of marital defiance against the creeping coldness. That memory, so warm and real, now felt like a ghost pressing against his back, mocking his current posture. How could a woman capable of that genuine passion, that shared vulnerability, be plotting his demise or planning her future with another man just weeks later? A wave of profound self-loathing washed over him. He was a voyeur, a predator in his own home, listening to his wife's private agony, whatever its source, and filtering it through his own suspicion and failure. The sheer indecency of his action, pressing his ear to the wood, made the back of his neck burn with shame. He was supposed to be the pillar, the one who protected her. Yet here he was, seeking the evidence that would destroy her to save his own ego. Clara's voice, though still hushed, seemed to soften, taking on a tone of resignation. I won't let my problems become his. He's already facing so much professional scrutiny. I need to be his strength, even if he hates me for the distance. It's better this way. A. Papers are signed. That sealed it. The legal maneuverings, the secret compartmentalization of their shared assets. He hates me for the distance. She understood his feelings, but chose the betrayal anyway, justifying it as a form of protection. His architect's mind finally found the clean line it craved. She was creating a financial and emotional escape route. The fleeting moment of confusion about the prognosis and pain evaporated. They were decoys, or perhaps metaphors for the pain of their separation and the prognosis of their broken future. Ethan rejected the scary, complex medical narrative and embraced the simpler, more familiar narrative of marital treason. He slowly backed away from the door, the resolution solidifying in his gut. He couldn't file the papers based on a suspicion tainted by his own weakness and eavesdropping guilt. He needed incontrovertible proof. He needed to see her face this mark to witness the exchange, to have the visual evidence that would forever silence the annoying, lingering questions of his heart. He glanced down at the unsigned divorce papers, now rendered momentarily useless. The pen felt heavy in his hand, not as an instrument of freedom, but as a weapon he was not yet ready to deploy. The following day, he would cancel his meeting with the firm's partners. He would leave his phone behind. He would follow her. He would become the shadow, and he would watch the perfect facade of their life finally shatter. The lie came easily, smooth, and polished. Ethan told his executive assistant he had a sudden, critical site visit downtown and canceled his morning's meetings, including the one with his lawyers that was now superseded by a far more urgent, self-appointed task. He was not wearing the bespoke suit of a celebrated architect, but an anonymous, dark, woolen coat. The collar pulled high, a costume for a spy in his own city. He had placed the GPS tracker, a tiny, absurdly modern device, beneath Clara's Escalade bumper the night before. Now, in his own unmarked sedan, he followed the discreet blue dot moving across his dashboard map. He expected the route to terminate in a trendy, discreet neighborhood, perhaps River North or an isolated, modern townhouse in Lincoln Park. He was prepared for the sight of a sleek restaurant or a boutique hotel, the perfect stage for a clandestine affair. Instead, the blue dot led him further south, away from the glittering, familiar pulse of the Loop and into an older, quieter district near the medical center. This was not the territory of power lunches or secret lovers. It was a grid of utilitarian brick buildings, municipal offices, and specialized clinics. The atmosphere was less about luxury and more about necessity. Ethan felt the first significant crack in his fortress of certainty. Why here? No high-end lover would choose this backdrop. It lacked the theatricality of an affair and possessed the sterile anonymity of business, but a very specific, somber kind of business. Clara pulled into a small, well-maintained parking lot adjacent to a massive, imposing building marked with small brass plaques bearing unfamiliar medical and research names. Ethan parked 2 blocks away and watched her approach. This was not the Clara Thorne he knew. The Clara he saw daily was a study in fierce, contained elegance. Spine straight, shoulders back, eyes bright with ambition. The woman who stepped out of the SUV was brittle. Her shoulders were slightly slumped. The expensive fabric of her coat seemed to weigh her down, and she moved with a careful, almost mechanical stiffness. She wasn't wearing the sharp, professional armor she usually donned. Her face, devoid of its customary subtle makeup, looked pale and drawn in the harsh autumn light. Ethan noticed a tremor in her hand as she reached into her bag for something, a small, involuntary shiver that spoke not of excitement or romantic anticipation, but of deep, physical exhaustion. The sight was unsettling. The physical evidence contradicted his meticulously constructed narrative. The woman who looked like she was heading to a tedious, unavoidable obligation could not also be the woman rushing into the arms of a passionate lover. Her beauty was still present, but it was overshadowed by a fragile vulnerability that felt profoundly alien. She paused by the entrance, taking a slow, deep breath, as if bracing herself for a plunge into cold water. Then, she pushed through the revolving glass doors of the building. The sign above the entrance, clearly visible to Ethan through his binoculars, read, Midwestern Center for Advanced Diagnostics and Specialty Care. The name hit him like a physical blow. Advanced Diagnostics, Specialty Care. Not a secret condo. Not a lawyer's office. A medical facility. The fury that had powered his pursuit began to drain away, replaced by a cold, unsettling confusion. He was momentarily paralyzed, the binoculars dropping slightly to rest on his chest. This location, this demeanor. It did not fit the template of betrayal. It fit the template of the words he had struggled to interpret on the phone. Prognosis. Last appointment. pain. But the hardened core of his suspicion did not entirely surrender. Ethan was a man who trusted evidence, and he had learned that the highest forms of deception are often cloaked in the mundane. Perhaps this was the perfect cover. A highly complicated, professional alibi to explain her absences and her fatigue. Perhaps Mark was a doctor, or a lawyer meeting her in a location less conspicuous than a downtown tower, using the cover of a medical appointment. He lowered his head onto the steering wheel, his breath fogging the glass. He felt disoriented, caught between the certainty of his wife's words on the phone and the ambiguity of her actions now. He hadn't found proof of infidelity, but he had found proof of a profound, painful secret. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had to go inside. He couldn't leave her alone in a place like this. Whether she was plotting her escape from him or fighting a battle he couldn't yet comprehend. He needed to know which specific door she had walked through. He needed to know the truth, whatever form of destruction it took. Ethan moved through the clinical halls of the Midwestern Center for Advanced Diagnostics, like a trespasser in a sacred space. The air was heavy with the antiseptic smell of clean tiles and the hushed anxiety of unseen patients. A stark, unforgiving contrast to the opulent, richly scented reality of his home. He took the elevator to the third floor, following the directory that Clara had briefly paused to study. The doors opened onto a wide, brightly lit corridor. His eyes scanned the directory map, mounted on the wall. His breath caught in his throat as his gaze locked onto the destination. The world tilted slightly. The meticulously constructed image of Clara meeting a lover in a clandestine suite shattered into a million painful shards. This place was not for secret romance. It was for silent, brutal battles. He retreated behind a structural column, his expensive coat suddenly feeling like a heavy, suffocating blanket. He watched Clara approach the reception desk. Her face, usually so guarded and expressionless in his presence, was now etched with a raw, almost unbearable weariness. She spoke softly to the nurse, her voice barely carrying over the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights. "I'm here for my appointment with Dr. Elena Vargas," Clara said, pulling her identification card from her purse. Clara Thorne. Dr. Elena Vargas. The name struck Ethan with the force of an actual blow. He recognized it. Vargas was a well-known, highly respected, and specialized oncologist, a pioneer in hematological disease research. Ethan had read about her once, years ago, in a Chicago magazine profile of the city's top medical minds. The single, horrifying truth slammed into him with the finality of a closing steel door. Mark wasn't a lover. Mark was likely her friend, her confidant, the only person she had entrusted with this monumental, terrifying secret. The last appointment wasn't a final rendezvous, but a clinical checkup. The papers to be signed were not divorce settlements, but perhaps medical directives or insurance forms. The floodgates of his memory burst open, washing away the toxic accumulation of his suspicion. He saw Clara flinching from his touch. Not because she was guilty, but perhaps because she was in physical discomfort. He saw the urgent, mysterious trips, not as escapades, but as these necessary, draining pilgrimages to the clinic. He remembered her lost appetite, her unexplained fatigue, the subtle way she had avoided bright lights and loud conversations in recent weeks. He hadn't seen the signs of illness. He had only seen the evidence of his own failure as a husband. The intense, burning rage he had nurtured for months disintegrated, replaced by a cold, seismic tremor of fear and regret. He wanted to throw up, to scream, to rewind the last 6 months and erase every callous thought he'd entertained, every bitter assumption he'd harbored. He, the brilliant architect, had been so focused on constructing the narrative of his own victimhood that he had missed the foundation of his wife's suffering. While he was drafting divorce papers, she was facing a diagnosis that could shatter their entire world. A profound, sickening realization of his own selfishness overwhelmed him. She had used the distance as a shield, not to protect her lover, but to protect him. She had believed he was too fragile after his professional setback, the loss of the Blackwood bid, to handle her devastating news. She had decided to bear the weight of a life-threatening illness in solitude, accepting his judgment and his growing contempt, all to preserve his emotional stability. He watched her disappear through a frosted glass door marked patient intake. She was utterly alone, facing her greatest fear in the cold, anonymous light of a clinic. While he stood outside, a shadow consumed by the shame of his catastrophic misjudgment. The love betrayal he had sought was a pathetic, small lie compared to the monstrous, protective truth she was carrying. Ethan knew then that he had not been betrayed. He had been excluded. And that exclusion, he finally understood, was the ultimate, agonizing act of a love so deep it was willing to sacrifice its own well-being and reputation for the sake of the other. He leaned against the cold wall, his entire body trembling. He hadn't found the proof he sought. He had found his reckoning. Ethan drove back to the West Loop apartment in a blur of motion and mounting hysteria. The sterile sight of the oncology unit lobby had vaporized the architect's cool demeanor, leaving behind a terrified, remorseful man. He bypassed the elevator and took the 3 flights of stairs 2 at a time, his lungs burning, a physical manifestation of the anguish twisting in his chest. He burst into the silent, luxurious apartment, its perfect stillness now feeling like a monumental lie. He headed straight for Clara's private study, a room he rarely entered, respecting the professional boundaries they had established years ago. Now, those boundaries felt suffocatingly meaningless. He sat before her minimalist desk, the surface clean and ordered, reflecting the control she maintained even in crisis. He found her laptop, a sleek aluminum shell that contained the secret core of her life. He hesitated for only a second, a final, useless nod to ethical conduct, before typing in the password he hadn't used in years, a combination of their first date anniversary and her mother's birthday. It worked instantly. The search was frantic, driven by a desperate need for the full, unvarnished truth. He wasn't looking for blame. He was looking for the shape of the disaster. He found a heavily encrypted folder labeled simply, "The Project." Inside were not design specs, but a series of dated files. The emails confirmed everything. Mark was Dr. Mark Alston, a specialist in hematology. The first email, dated 4 months prior, referenced a confirmed diagnosis of a complex autoimmune disorder with early indications of chronic leukemia. The later exchanges detailed treatment plans, prognosis updates, and the logistics of her confidential appointments. His gaze fell upon a document titled, "Notes to Self." Why the silence? It wasn't a formal letter, but a raw, stream of consciousness entry, clearly written late at night, stained with what looked like dried tears. I saw his face after the Blackwood loss. He looked hollowed out. That terrible, haunted look he gets when he questions everything he's ever built. His masterpiece project, gone. If I tell him now, it's a double destruction. He'll collapse. He'll stop working. He'll become my nurse, not my husband, and I'll be the failure that finally broke him. I love him too much to let my body become the wreckage of his world. I have to be strong. I have to create the distance. Let him believe I'm cold. Let him believe I'm distracted. Even let him think the worst. The distance is my shield for him. The anger he feels is safer than the pity he would offer. He needs time to heal his career first. I need 1 more week to get the final prognosis, to get my own head straight, before I hand him the pen to sign the papers for a different kind of ending than he anticipates. He doesn't need a burden. He needs his wife back. Ethan read the entry 3 times. Each word a hammer blow against his heart. His eyes filled, not with anger, but with the searing shame of incomprehension. He had interpreted her distance as rejection, her silence as betrayal, her absences as lust. In reality, every single painful action was an act of profound, protective love. She hadn't created a wall to keep him out of her secrets. She had created a wall to keep the crushing weight of her reality from destroying him in his most vulnerable moment. He realized the moral calculus of her decision. She preferred the temporary pain of his contempt to the permanent devastation of his collapse. He gently closed the laptop, the screen reflecting his own distorted, weeping face. He was the focus of her sacrifice, the beneficiary of her agony, and he had repaid her by plotting to leave. The papers he was about to sign weren't the end of their marriage due to lack of love, but a final, tragic misunderstanding born of too much love and too little trust. The true failure of their marriage was not a lack of passion, but a crippling inability to share their weakness. He had believed they were too strong to break. She had believed he was too weak to bear the truth. Both had been tragically wrong. Ethan returned to his office, the glow of the city lights reflecting dully off the glass walls. The apartment was still empty, offering him the privacy to execute the final, ceremonial act of his delusion. He picked up the stack of divorce papers, the documents that were supposed to grant him freedom from his misery, and felt their crisp weight. They now represented his colossal failure of perception and love. He began to tear them. Not in one clean rip of anger, but slowly, meticulously, into smaller and smaller pieces. The sound of the tearing paper was loud in the silence. A fragile, snapping echo of the promises they had broken to each other. He watched the white confetti rain down onto the dark mahogany desk, symbolic ashes of the perfect narrative he had constructed, and the perfect marriage that had almost ended because of his pride. He swept the debris into a small pile. The physical destruction of the papers felt like an inadequate penance for the psychological damage he had inflicted on himself and the emotional isolation he had forced upon Clara. He didn't know how long he sat there, bathed in the remorseful light of the late afternoon. He was no longer waiting for a confrontation. He was waiting for a confession that he now understood was made of fear, not malice. When Clara finally returned, the sound of her key turning in the lock was soft. She walked into the living room, dropped her heavy leather tote bag with an exhausted sigh, and then walked toward the kitchen, passing his office door. She paused. She saw the debris on his desk, the scattered remnants of the legal documents, and the look on Ethan's face, a devastation far greater than any professional failure. She didn't need a single word. She knew. The wall she had painstakingly built, brick by painful brick, had finally collapsed. Clara walked slowly into the office. She didn't scream, didn't defend, didn't ask how he knew. She simply looked at the pieces of the divorce petition, then at his eyes, which were wet and red. The look in his eyes wasn't accusation. It was the reflection of her own agonizing burden, suddenly shared. It was a mirror of terrifying, shared vulnerability. She opened her mouth, perhaps to utter a weak apology or a frantic explanation. But Ethan moved first. He rose from his chair, crossed the short distance between them, and without a word, reached for her hand. His grasp was not aggressive or demanding, but firm, grounding, and infinitely gentle. He held her gaze. In his eyes, Clara saw the horrifying journey he had taken, the suspicion, the spying, the trip to the oncology unit, and finally, the discovery of her private notes. She saw the depth of his shame for doubting her love and the magnitude of his fear for her life. Clara's resolve crumbled. Her shoulders shook, and the elegant composure she had maintained for months dissolved. Tears, hot and heavy, finally poured down her face. Not tears of guilt, but of release. Of sheer, physical relief that she no longer had to fight this battle alone. Ethan pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her tightly. A primal, protective embrace that anchored her to him. It was a silent implosion of all the unspoken grief, the fear, and the misjudgment that had poisoned their life. "I'm so sorry," he finally whispered, his voice thick with tears, his chin resting on the crown of her head. He wasn't apologizing for finding out. He was apologizing for every thought of betrayal, for every silent, judgmental moment of the past 6 months. "I'm so sorry, I didn't see you. I'm so sorry, I believed a lie instead of your heart." Clara didn't articulate her defense, the explanation of protecting him from the double blow. She didn't need to. Her stifled sob and the desperate way she clung to him was her wordless confession. "Yes, I hid it. I did it because I love you, and I thought you couldn't take it." In that embrace, the silent exchange was complete. He offered forgiveness for the exclusion, and she offered forgiveness for his catastrophic lack of trust. The weight of the secret, once hers alone, now settled heavily upon both their shoulders, transformed instantly from a solitary burden into a shared future. The old marriage had died on the desk with the torn paper, and from its ashes, a new, painfully honest commitment was being forged in the tearful silence. The days following the silent implosion of Chapter 7 were marked by a tender, fragile honesty that had been absent from their marriage for nearly a decade. The luxurious apartment no longer felt like a showcase. It became a sanctuary where perfection was banished, and raw, trembling vulnerability was finally allowed to breathe. Ethan immediately assumed the role of partner, not just husband. He called Dr. Vargas's office, introduced himself, and began the exhausting, meticulous process of scheduling, learning, and advocacy. He pored over medical journals, using his architect's precision to understand the complex language of Clara's diagnosis, a way of feeling useful, of feeling like he was rebuilding something vital. He traded the blueprints of skyscrapers for the charts of blood work. Clara allowed herself to be cared for, a profound act of trust and surrender. She had spent months being the fiercely independent warrior, and now she leaned into his support. For the first time, she allowed her exhaustion to show, her pain to be acknowledged. Their conversation wasn't about the past infidelity he suspected, but about the real, deep wounds that had caused their distance. One evening, sitting in the soft glow of their living room, not talking about work or social calendars, but simply holding hands, Ethan finally spoke about the Blackwood loss, the defeat that had initiated his depressive spiral. "I felt like a fraud," he confessed, his voice low and strained. "That project was supposed to be my legacy. When I lost it, I felt like I lost my worth. And because I felt worthless, I assumed your distance meant you agreed. I thought I was only worth as much as my next award." Clara squeezed his hand. "And I saw that terror in your eyes, Ethan. That's why I couldn't tell you. I couldn't stand the thought of being the thing that finally broke your spirit. I thought if I could just manage this alone, if I could keep the professional facade, you would have the space to heal your pride. I was so focused on protecting your career, I forgot to protect our marriage." They realized they had both been operating under the same crippling delusion, that love meant never showing weakness. They were the power couple who had mistaken their armor for their skin, their roles reversed. Clara's appointments became the most important dates on their shared calendar, eclipsing every board meeting and client lunch. Ethan was there for every consultation, every test, asking the sharp, necessary questions that Clara, exhausted by fear and treatment, could not form. They were a team again, fighting an external enemy, and the intimacy of this shared struggle was deeper than any romance they had ever known. The ending of their story was not a magical remission, but a hard-won commitment to the long road ahead. The doctor's prognosis was guarded. The future was uncertain. But that uncertainty no longer held the terror of isolation. The final scene took place not in the city, but on a quiet weekend getaway to a small cottage by Lake Michigan. They were sitting on a porch, the air crisp and cold. Clara, thinner and slightly fragile, was resting her head on Ethan's shoulder. "I don't know what's next," she murmured, looking out at the choppy gray water. Ethan shifted, drawing her closer. He pointed to the horizon. "The lake is beautiful, but it's full of currents and storms we can't control. We spent 15 years building a perfect yacht, Clara, but we forgot how to sail it together when the weather turned. Now, we're in a rowboat, and it's messy, and it's terrifying. But we're finally rowing in the same direction." He kissed her forehead, a promise sealed not with passion, but with profound, enduring fidelity. Their marriage was no longer a glittering showpiece of ambition, but a testament to quiet, tenacious survival. They had learned that true love wasn't the absence of problems, but the courage to face the unspeakable ones side by side. Realizing that sometimes, the greatest betrayal is not of the heart, but of the truth. They were finally, fully, home.